Welcome to Instruction Discussion, our weekly look at the latest topics and trends in education affecting schools here on Long Island and schools around the world. Whether you're a teacher, parent, or student, listen for tips and strategies to help you navigate the educational landscape. There's a bell. It's time to start today's Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hello, I'm Kevin Boston Hill, and welcome to Instruction Discussion, where each week we will examine a recent trend or development in education and its impact on Long Island. There's a movement underway that seems to be a throwback to an era we thought was far behind us. As our society struggles to get our youth to read and enjoy the classics, we find that there are many sections of our country that do not believe these books should be in our schools at all. Books like The Great Gatsby, Native Son, To Kill a Mockingbird, Uncle Tom's Cabin, Night, Charlotte's Web, and many others. Many that we grew up with and enjoyed reading over and over are being pulled from the shelves of our school libraries and in many instances destroyed. Most of these books are works of fiction, but they reflect aspects of our history that cannot be denied nor forgotten about. To destroy these books creates a chasm in our collective history and does not present a true picture of who we are. The issues raised and themes of these books may not be very palatable, but it is who we were, and by trying to erase any record of that past only serves to show that we still bear those thoughts and actions. We can't just simply put our heads in the sand and hope it all goes away. We must confront these issues head on. Joining us to discuss the pervasive issue of book banning, today we welcome to the classroom education journalist and editor-in-chief of the award-winning Hechinger Report, Liz Willen. Welcome to Instruction Discussion on 90.3 WHPC. Before we actually do get started, I understand that you once wrote for The Rag in Northport, New York, and you were part of Bloomberg News for a little while as well. But where else has your career taken you?
Well, I spent a lot of time on Long Island, actually, at Newsday. And my career began in Newsday. I was doing a lot of covering a lot of the issues that are super important to Long Islanders, taxes, high taxes, traffic, zoning, and of course, education. I spent a fair amount of time in school board meetings. And then I joined New York Newsday in 1992.
What made you research and write the column that is in the current issue of the Hechinger Report? And I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Hechinger, yes. Hechinger.
So the article that recently appeared is, "Are book bans stopping a Marxist revolution or whitewashing the past?" So what prompted that particular article? Well,
actually, Kevin, it was a throwback. It was hilarious to me. I was actually in Indiana on an unrelated story. I was reporting on middle schools and what they're doing in terms of career training at a younger and younger age in the pandemic. And while I was in Indiana, I kept reading and stories about a big debate they were having about a bill that was all around banning of books. And I started doing more and more research into it. And then suddenly, oh my God, there I was. It was the ghost of Mary Cummins. She is a Queen's grandmother who bought down school chancellor Joseph Fernandez more than 25 years ago. And it was a story that I worked on for more than a year. When I came from Long Island Newsday to New York Newsday, I was working in Queens and covering school boards and school meetings. And I was looking through an agenda and saw that there was a school board that wanted to ban a curriculum called Children of the Rainbow. And they were particularly upset about some of the books that were optional on the reading list, included Heather Has Two Mommies, Daddy Has a Roommate, and Gloria Goes to Gay Pride. I don't think I will ever forget those books or that story, because it's all I covered for more than 14 months at New York Newsday. It was nonstop. This one school board banned the curriculum, then others banned the curriculum, then the school's chancellor suspended the board for banning the books. And then ultimately, at the end of all of this, with tons of protests everywhere, signs and screaming at board meetings, and outside of what was then 110 Livingston Street, which was the Board of Education headquarters, I remember people holding signs saying, God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. And, we don't want our children learning about homosexuality. This was more than 25 years ago. So what was happening in Indiana brought back my memories of being a young reporter covering this story. And so many people had gotten involved at this point, the NAACP and also American Civil Liberties Union, big questions about book banning. And then when I started looking at what was happening in Indiana and elsewhere in the country, I realized, oh my God, here we go again. It's 1992 all over again.
Yeah, it seems I remember that was early on in my teaching career that had actually come to light. And we were having those conversations with my colleagues into my schools, and like, how can we go back to, because now that's throwing it back even further, not just 1992, but that's throwing it back even further. We're going back into the 50s, 40s and 50s now. We start thinking about the Scopes monkey trial, where they were trying to get rid of, or the teaching of evolution.
That's right.
At that point. So it's how do we proceed as a society if we can't even discuss the things that are real within our society? Because that was a time, and it still is a time, that is real, that, Heather will have two mommies or two daddies. And because that's something that's really happening in our society. So when we have books that are mirrors, or to act as mirrors on what we see, how can we be so dismissive of them and not want other people to understand and learn about them?
Well, clearly there are a lot of people concerned about this on a number of levels, including censorship and including teachers who are getting death threats, and including librarians and others who believe strongly that teachers have the right to accurately portray real events and real things that are happening in the United States. So really, it's coming up again. As you pointed out, these bans are not new. For me, what triggered it was looking at the opposition in Indiana and finding that Heather Has Two Mommies was still being banned and still in a book. But yeah, this goes back to the Scopes trial a century ago. And book bans have been going on for many, many years. But now it's really stepped up. Not only in terms of the books that are being banned, including Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which portrays mice and discusses the whole world of Nazism in a concentration camp. That book is now being banned. By the way, the book banning is doing a really good job for sales. It was hitting number one on the best-selling list. So some authors don't mind terribly when their books are being banned, because it brings a lot more people more interest in them.
As they say, there's no such thing as bad press, right?
Yeah. But what I was looking at now, what's really different here is that we have state legislatures everywhere getting deeply involved. That's what's going on in Indiana. And in Texas, there's a House committee investigating books on race and sexuality. There's bans just about everywhere in the country. There's more and more parent groups popping up now, or one is called No Left Turn in Education. They've created a list of books. Members say that these books demean our nation and its heroes, revise our history, and divide us as a people for the purpose of indoctrinating kids to a dangerous ideology. So this group doesn't want words like diversity, equity, inclusion, social justice, systemic racism, human rights education, and health education at all to be mentioned, because they conceal what they call an aggressive, radical, totalitarian ideology. So yeah, this is cyclical, but what I do see now is far more involvement of the state legislatures. And that's worrisome, because there are bills all over the country that are being introduced. And in Indiana, the initial Senate bill created a public outcry and was withdrawn. The state senator who authored it said it would require teachers to remain impartial, even as they discussed Marxism, Nazism, and fascism, which is a little bit difficult.
Yeah, like how do you expect someone, especially who may be of a particular faith or something, to just kind of gloss over those particular ideologies? I mean, that's not something that you just put up there and say, okay, we're going to put this on the PowerPoint and here's what it was. It's not as simple as a dictionary definition when you go through those things. It's going to drum up some sort of emotion that has to be dealt with.
Yeah, there's no question. On the other hand, some of the parents, like I was mentioning, Purple for Parents, and there's a bunch of other groups, their concerns are different. So we have a number of trends happening here simultaneously. One of them is the discussion of race, sexuality, and gender. And then there's a whole nother topic, and that's around the teaching of something called critical race theory, which right now actually isn't even being taught. But there's such a fear of it, and I think a lot of this has to do with they're just an enormous concern that white children are going to be made to feel guilty for the sins of the past, and there's a lot of concern around that.
But where's the problem in that? I saw a cartoon of this a little while ago that it was a picture of Ruby Bridges going to school. And the caption read that you have the grandparents today, the grandparents today are the one who are trying to prevent this type of thing from getting out, were the ones who were trying to prevent this little girl from going to school back in the day. So it's just that it's kind of gone along with the evolution that you're the ones who created this mess. And now today you're trying to cover it up, that type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, and that's called the whitewashing of history. And that's really threatening to teachers who are social studies teachers and teachers who are threatening history. And that goes beyond book bans. That's a real attempt to get involved in curriculum. And I've even seen in some of the bills that they want cameras in the classrooms to monitor what teachers write. And in the Indiana bill that I was researching, what they were really looking at was they wanted the teachers have to post absolutely everything they were going to teach and put them on a website before they teach them, which opens up to more parental control. So I also see this as part of a growing movement that parents want more say and more control over teachers. They want more control over how things are taught and what their children should learn about American culture and society and history. And the other movement, and I reference this, and I really see this more, is that the involvement of state legislatures and the levers of local and state government as a way of controlling teachers and pushing an entirely different view of what is being taught and how it's being taught.
But I find it extremely ironic that one of the biggest arguments that they have, and you mentioned it before, is that they're afraid that our youth is going to be indoctrinated with the particular ideals. Well, by bringing the legislature into all of this and by putting cameras in the classroom and by taking books out of the curriculum and all that, aren't you doing that same thing? Aren't you doing what you just feared?
It does seem a bit hypocritical. It really does. And it's problematic. And the thing that I think about as a reporter who's long been covering education is that this is, I feel, another threat to public education. We have recently found in some articles that we've been writing, more parents choosing homeschooling. There's been a very difficult time during the pandemic. More teachers are quitting and they're fed up and they're exhausted. We're hearing this all the time. And in many places, there's teacher shortages. So when you have legislatures and parents pushing this on top of it all, I think you're going to lead to a bigger exodus of teachers and a bigger exodus of people from the public school system on both sides. Some who really disagree with this kind of interference and might be concerned that their children aren't learning the things they believe that are really important. And the others who are getting hysterical because, God forbid, their children should learn the history of racism or learn, that in fact there are women named Heather and Heathers like them, more Heathers out there that have had children in non-traditional ways and that are gay. That's really upsetting to the LGBTQ community. I'm hearing a lot from them as well. So the concerns that are coming in from many different levels about this, but I do see the greater threat to public education as we have known it.
You are listening to Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Kevin Boston Hill, and our guest today is education journalist and editor-in-chief of the award-winning Hechinger Report, Liz Willen. I wanted to talk about that last point that you just made just a little bit, because when we start talking about, like I said, it's getting a lot bigger. Book banning is getting a lot bigger than just removing books from libraries. Now you're talking about really changing curriculum. You're changing the way people think about their society and the way we grew up. You're almost changing history. And you're really getting more of that, of government is becoming a lot more pervasive into the lives of ordinary Americans. That's in and of itself, that's akin to communist countries, isn't it? That's something where we're talking about where those governments have complete control over what their citizens think. And that's something that we're up in arms about on every level.
Yeah, I mean, one of the people I was researching and speaking to about this called this new way of the Republican-controlled states where the legislatures are really trying to ban so many of these practices and so many of these books. They're calling it an educational gag order, which I think is really interesting because it definitely goes to, more, as you mentioned, more state control, more political control over, our history and how it's taught.
One of the big issues that has been in the news over the last year or so has been, of course, the 1619 Project, critical race theory and things like that. But what people aren't understanding is not about elevating one's race above another one, is just trying to equalize the information that's being put out there. Because if you look at, I was a social studies teacher myself. And so, of course, we know that all the history books are written from a particular perspective. And so I had to supplement that education with a lot of my students having taught in the Bronx. I had to supplement what was being taught because it wasn't in their books. And that's that's the same thing that a lot of teachers across the country do on a regular basis. And now you
get in trouble for supplementing.
Right. And now you're talking about criminalizing that activity that is just in certain circles, that was just called good teaching. And now good teaching is becoming a criminal act.
Right. And then somebody who wants to be a good teacher and who believes in what they're doing is going to feel really threatened by this and maybe decide not to go into teaching. Right. Because it's that passion for helping children learn. But say, for example, you wanted to teach them about civil rights legislation and maybe have a field trip to a place. Now, would you not be able to take them to certain museums under these rules? Would you not be able to teach them about the voting rights in Mississippi? Would you not be able to teach about the death of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner in Mississippi during that time period? There's a lot of things here that must be very frightening to teachers. You also mentioned the 1619 Project, and that has indeed become a real target here. That has triggered a lot of these bills and a lot of this concept that's really not right, that's incorrect. Conservatives have become sort of fixated on the idea that this book is going to be taught and that it's going to make white children feel uncomfortable, and that they're lumping in this thing they're calling critical race theory as something that they're all really worried about being taught, and they're trying to ban it, when it's actually not even something that is being taught.
Right. That's the real funny part about it. And what I would like to find interesting, I don't know if you know the answer to this, but in Indiana, since you were there, how are they working about the teaching of the Ku Klux Klan? Because that was a center pretty much of the Ku Klux Klan in its heyday. So how do they feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's something one of the teachers brought up, and it's fascinating, right? If they can't teach the history of something that went on in their own state, it's actually akin to what I was talking about in Mississippi, because these bills are front and center there, too. What if they can't teach? There's such a history of racist incidents and lynchings, and I've been to the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, which opened in Jackson, Mississippi a few years ago, and it's really eye-opening. And no one has brought this up yet, but I wonder if field trips there could no longer take place because it might be too triggering to white children, according to some of these laws. I mean, there's enormous attempts here to prevent children in their own states from learning what happened. And for the longest time in Indiana, members of the Ku Klux Klan, it was so pervasive among politicians and others there. It's a scary thing, and a lot of the teachers that I've talked to are very, very concerned about this, particularly wanting to know their own state's history, because there are many curriculums involved that teach children about history in their own state. Mm-hmm. How will they be able to tell children the truth?
Right. I mean, they'll probably have something in there about the Ku Klux Klan because, like you said, they were so pervasive in legislature and all forms of government and everything. But how much of it are they going to really teach?
At its peak in the 1920s, for example, an estimated 30% of all Indiana's native-born white men, the governor, and more than half of state legislators were members of the Ku Klux Klan. So if you're not allowed to teach about it, you are ignoring and blocking an opportunity to learn a great deal of that state's history.
What are the students thinking or saying about this type of, because we know that high school students and even middle school students are quite astute. And so I know that they must have some type of feeling about all these things that are going on as well. And too many times we don't take into account the student voice. So
that is a great question. And the reason that is so important is because they're not heard from here. You're hearing so much from parents, Purple for Parents, and there's another group called Red, Wine, and Blue that's on the other side of things. But I did spend a lot of time listening to students. I listened to a press conference in Indiana where there were several students were on it, and these were students who were super concerned about censorship. I'm going to quote one of them. Her name was Lizzie Koshnick. I really enjoyed listening to her. She's a junior at North Central High School in Indianapolis. And she asked, how will the future leaders of America be able to provide for a country they know nothing about? Teaching real history will not bring children down based on the color of their skin, but will raise them up and inspire them to stand up and not repeat gruesome patterns. I mean, today's teenagers, for example, are terribly sophisticated. They're on their phones all day long. They have access to Google. They're on TikTok. They have so many devices and so many ways of getting information. So it's going to seem not only hypocritical, but sort of absurd for them because they can easily access the information they need. And then to have the school teaching them this completely either whitewashed or non-existent version of events will be not only contrary to what they're able to understand and know on their own, but when you think about them preparing for a college education, all of the things that higher ed represents are, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, different views, the ability to learn all sides of stories, the classics and humanities, all of these things. So I'm concerned that they're going to show up in college, as I've heard some of them say, completely unprepared unless they access and find this information on their own.
And that's the scary part. I mean, how do you really teach someone to be a critical thinker if you only give them one side of any story and tell them that's the only side that you're allowed to take a look at? I mean, pick your favorite dystopian movie here, because that's what's happening in our society now. We're slowly moving towards an era where I think it was like Brave New World. It'll be funny now if that finds its way on the book banning as well, even though that kind of describes exactly what the type of world that we're talking about.
Yeah, I have not seen that in particularly on the list. I've been looking through the list. It's fascinating to me, some of the things that are banned. I mean, Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye.
Yeah, I don't understand that. Yes.
Oh, there's parents there that are worried about the book's depictions of sexual abuse. And then the others, the more predictable ones, like Heather Has Two Mommies. But I don't know if you heard this in Tennessee the other day. A pastor was burning Harry Potter. I mean, my kids were reading that in kindergarten.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I remember, again, when the Harry Potter movies and the books started to become popular, that people were, it talks about witchcraft, and we can't have that in our schools and everything. And like, come on, that's what our kids, again, it's fantasy. It's fantasy. Why are you attacking these fantasy books? Now, I can almost understand like a book like Huckleberry Finn, because I know because of his depictions of Jim and being a former slave and so forth, and the language that was used therein. But even so, are you talking about Huckleberry Finn was the companion book to Tom Sawyer? So, right. I mean, how do you get rid of that? Those are about little boys who are growing up and seeing the world through their eyes. Absolutely.
But one thing that's incredibly important to remember in this debate, that there's been some book banning from the left as well. So we can't put all of this on conservative legislatures and parents. Let's remember, do you want to know what the 7th most challenged book nationwide was recently?
What was that?
Released To Kill a Mockingbird.
Yep.
And you know why that was banned? It was because of challenge for racial slurs and their negative effect on students. There was a fear that it featured a white savior character, and that its perception of the Black experience. So that wasn't the right who was banning that. So we have a very hypersensitive way of discussing all of these issues. And somebody recently referred to it not as the Red Scare, but as the Ed Scare.
I believe we have to really think about what is it that we're trying to teach our children, because we can't keep going to these extremes. And just because something is said, because again, as I mentioned before, a lot of these books are just mirrors of what's happening in our societies, because the authors are writing what they see, what they know about. And that's what's been going on. So now we have to look at these as these teachable moments where we can have conversations with our children about what they're reading and what we're exposing them to, because they're being exposed to these things. And there's no stopping that.
No, there is no stopping that. And like I was saying earlier, they're going to find their own way. I mean, schools can go ahead and ban these books, but they're going to make them more popular and kids are going to get their hands on them. And they just will. So you've got activist groups all over the country, really pushing the censorship issue. And I said earlier, these things were cyclical because I was so triggered by having covered that issue more than 25 years ago. But now I think it's gotten a lot more complicated because we have a bunch of different ideologies converging on this. And it's not just about, that book was those books that issue that I was covering were specifically around race and gender and the teaching of it in classrooms. Now we have added into that things like pornography that people are concerned about. And we also have added, what they're deeming that. And again, the 1619 Project and this whole issue of critical race theory. And I think also, we have more conservative legislatures and they're feeling empowered over other aspects of people's life. Remember the debates over mask mandates and how ugly those got, and school boards all over the country. So I think it's a number of things have both exacerbated the trend that I wrote about it and made it more complicated on a number of levels.
Well, we could have this conversation all day, and there are a lot of other areas I would like to branch off into that we may have to save for another conversation. But we would definitely like to thank our guest today, education journalist and editor-in-chief of the award-winning Hechinger Report, Liz Willen, for coming on to our show today.
Thanks very much. And if you don't mind letting everyone know, you can sign up for our newsletter for free, www.hechingerreport.org. And we are really all over the country looking at these issues. Very important issues of our time, and I welcome the chance to talk to you about them.
Well, once again, my name is Kevin Boston Hill, and thank you all for listening to Instruction Discussion right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.